and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be exploring Graceland's property because it was fascinating before Elvis even set foot on it. Let's dive in. Initially, this was of course all Native American land. The Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes hunted these grounds until the 1830s. In 1837, the Chickasaw were forced out, where they then followed the Choctaws' path across the Mississippi River during the Trail of Tears. For more than half a century, the land remained untouched fields where it was parceled off and exchanged hands several times. So a lot of you know that Graceland was named after Grace 𝐓𝐢𝐻. But who was she? What was her life like? What I learned definitely surprised me. Grace Bates 𝐓𝐢𝐻 was the daughter of S.C. 𝐓𝐢𝐻, a prominent businessman in Memphis. His company, S.C. 𝐓𝐢𝐻 & Co., was the largest printing and bookbinding companies in the South. It's over 150 years old and still in business today, and was family-owned until the 1990s. So the 𝐓𝐢𝐻s were very high society people. Grace married Nashville native Kenneth Augustus Ward, the stepson of a Tennessee governor, in a night ceremony in February 1881. It was pouring rain, but that's supposed to be good luck. Grace was 21, Augustus was 24, and an up-and-coming attorney. A description of the wedding says, "The chandeliers were half hid in evergreens, exotics, magnolias, and tropical plants, while music soft and exquisite rose upon the perfumed air." So law didn't pan out for Augustus, so he switched gears. Cotton was king in Memphis, but the other hot commodity was lumber. Augustus ran a lumber company called Memphis Barrel and Heading, where he also acted as the treasurer and was in charge of the funds. In 1894, Grace and Augustus bought 320 acres where Graceland and Whitehaven is located today. They were active in their church and had no kids that I know of. They had a nice life and home on the property, not Graceland, but a home that was there before, and everything was fine for 14 years. Until October 1895, when suddenly tons of money was missing, and so were Augustus and Grace. Over $200,000, which is a lot of money even now, but today would equal over $7 million, was withdrawn and stolen from banks and citizens of Memphis. Augustus had been forging signatures and cashing checks, literally stealing people's life savings. Once the banks realized something was up and the walls began caving in, allegedly he told Grace and they fled immediately. This was a huge nationwide scandal and was reported in newspapers across the country. Their destination was Honduras by way of New Orleans and Belize. Augustus chose Honduras because it didn't have an extradition agreement with the United States. So how was Augustus able to embezzle so much money? So he would draw up the paperwork, have one investor sign with the assurance another would soon sign, then forge the next names. The bank staff would verify the first, then assume the following were legitimate as well. Banks in several major U.S. cities had a lot of fake paperwork and lost cash. Augustus was a well-respected businessman in Memphis, so he relied on his status as well as the status of the signatures on the paperwork that it would go through unnoticed. The majority of the money came from brokers and banks, but tens of thousands of dollars came from widows. He reportedly scanned the obituaries, preying on widows of deceased men with life insurance policies. An article titled "The Augustus Kenneth Ward Forgery Scandal in Memphis" by James B. Jones Jr. states, "He was the superintendent of a Sunday school and was renowned as the loudest singer in the congregation. He used this standing in the church to gain the victim's trust." In 1896, the Memphis Commercial Appeal reported, "He is one of the most unique scoundrels of the century. He did not rob the banks as an ordinary forger does, but he robbed and abused his friends. To him, the widow and the orphan were fair game, and those who had every reason to trust him were his natural prey." It appears he relied on his wife's social status to gain connections and climb up the ladder in business, but he was just cultivating this double life. There are also rumors that he had another home in Memphis where he held other activities. It seemed like this couple had it all, so why did he do this? His father-in-law, S.C. 𝐓𝐢𝐻, had been giving him money to jumpstart his business. When he burned through that and accrued a bunch of debt, Mr. 𝐓𝐻 paid it off but refused to keep giving him money. To maintain his lifestyle, he began forging these signatures. As soon as they got off the boat in Honduras, they laid low at a hotel. Augustus then purchased several hundred acres in the jungles with plans of establishing a cotton mill within a few years. Finally, after pressure from the Tennessee and U.S. governments, the Honduran police arrested Augustus. Though they agreed to arrest him, their agency required the U.S. send over the proper paperwork, as well as a request in person. After no word from Washington, they released him. Memphis's chief of police personally went after him and was able to arrest him in Guatemala and bring him back to Memphis. And this was the 1890s. They traveled by boat and train, which probably took weeks. A few weeks into the ordeal, Grace returned home completely embarrassed and quickly got divorced. She took her maiden name back, and the 320 acres in Whitehaven became hers alone. Augustus went to the city jail, but newspapers reported he was dying and was moved to a hospital. But obviously he was fine, he just didn't want to be in jail. An article from an October 1896 Flagstaff newspaper reported if he's convicted, he'd have to serve 1,425 years in jail. The trial dragged on for 3 years, where Augustus was found guilty and sentenced to just 3 years, but only ended up serving 2.5 and of course had special treatment. From there, he remarried and spent the rest of his life in Nashville. In 1908, Grace's mother, Mary Tooth, passed away and left her the 160 acres adjacent to her property. That brought her total acreage up to 480. In fact, in official land records, this area is referred to as Miss Grace's 480 acres. On paper, it appears Grace lived a full life. She traveled all around the world, including the United Kingdom, Canada, and Bermuda, and back home she tended to an impressive vegetable garden. She was known to grow sweet potatoes and store them in the cellar. Let's talk about Grace's family for a bit. This might get a bit confusing because there are 3 Ruths, but I will call them by their full names. Grace was close with her sister Ruth Tooth, who actually accompanied her back from Honduras so she didn't have to face the press alone. Ruth Tooth went to college in New York and was a member of the 19th Century Club in Memphis, a women's activist club. She was married to Battle Manassas Brown, who was named after the Battle of Manassas in 1861, which was on the day he was born. Battle was a former gymnast, owner of the cotton company Battle M. Brown & Co., and director of his father-in-law's business, S.C. Tooth & Co. Ruth Tooth Brown and Battle Brown were the parents of Ruth Brown Moore, who, along with her husband, Dr. Thomas Moore, built Graceland, but we'll get to that in a second. Grace passed away in her home in 1928 at 68 years old, and it's actually her niece's husband, Dr. Thomas Moore, listed as the doctor on her death certificate. A little backstory on him: Dr. Thomas Moore, or TD for short, was actually considered a genius and graduated college at 17 years old. The 480 acres that Grace owned was divided amongst her nieces and nephews, with some buying a bit more off the other. In the end, the Moores owned the northern 180 acres. Graceland was built in 1939, and the Moores modestly described it as a country home. Ruth Brown Moore's parents, Ruth Tooth Brown and Battle Brown, lived with them until Battle's death in 1955. He died at Baptist Hospital, and his obituary lists his residence as Graceland. This is when TD got extremely interested in cattle farming, and his business became known as Graceland Farm. He produced such high-quality cattle that he was named president of the Mid-South Cattle Breeders Association in 1940. Business was booming. According to From DeSoto to Elvis, A Brief History of Graceland Farm by Chris Miksanek, during exhibitions, TD was selling prized bulls at several thousand apiece, which is equivalent to tens of thousands today. During the height of Graceland Farm, there could be 150 bulls on their land. He specialized in the hornless Pole Hereford. TD's favorite bull was named Rollo Domino II, and he was the king of the barn long before Elvis's rising sun. Rollo was so spoiled, he is the reason that the barn had AC before Graceland. After just 10 years, the Moores were ready to retire and actually divorced, so they sold the business and remaining cattle. They gave their daughter Ruth Marie Cobb a fourth of the farm, which is about 18 acres. She then inherited more land after her father passed away a few years later. Ruth Cobb donated a bit to the Christian church next door, sold 160 acres to a developer before selling the remaining 13 or so to Elvis. And that is it. As always, thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe for more adventures.